Hi everybody, and welcome to the video on specific immunity. So let's start by taking a look at this guy. This is our bad guy. It could be a bacteria or bacterium. It could be a virus, like the influenza virus. It could be a protist, like malaria. It could be a cell that's gone rogue, a cancerous cell. It could be a cell from a transplanted organ in your body. Or even as harmless as something like pollen, where your body tries to attack it. It's a bad guy. And all of these things have in common the peripheral proteins around them, known as antigens on the outside. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about antigens today, but before we really delve into the specifics of that, let's kind of go through an overview of how the immune system is organized. So there's 3 lines of defense. The first line is non-specific, basically trying to block any invader from invading our body. And so it seems obvious, but our skin is a first line of defense. Simply keeps the bad guys out. Also, our mucous membranes are a line of defense, where simply they're lined with these sticky little hairs called cilia that trap debris and invading pathogens and simply swish them away in our mucus. And another big line of defense in the first tier is the acid in our stomach, which simply dissolves those pathogens along with food that we've ingested. So those are the major hitters of the first line of defense. They're external barriers to invading pathogens. And then once they do get in, because yes, they will get in, we have a second line of defense that's still not specific, including the complement proteins, macrophages, lymph nodes, and the process of inflammation. Now, what we're going to delve into is the specific line of defense, also known as the third line of defense. And so this third line of defense is a very customized, specific attack on specific bad guys. It involves a lot of cells. It involves these macrophages and helper T cells, killer T cells, plasma B cells, you name it. There's a lot of players doing a lot of different things. So this is the third line of defense. We're going to begin with how those bad guys are actually recognized. And so I've thrown around this word earlier, start with antigens. That's how they're recognized. But let me clarify something about antigens. All of our cells have antigens. They're peripheral proteins that are just ID badges, like that say, hey, I belong to you. Now, the bad thing is, or good thing, I guess, is that those antigens are on every other thing, from pollen to bacteria. But what's good about them is that they help our bodies recognize antigens that aren't itself, that are foreign. And so there's different white blood cells in our body that respond differently to those foreign antigens. The B cells recognize antigens that are whole and intact. We'll show you what that looks like. And then T cells recognize fragments of those antigens, and we'll go through that pathway as well. So within the third line of defense, we're going to start with the B cell strategy of defense and then work our way to the T cells. So here is our B cell response. We have our antigen. It's invaded our pathogen with those antigens displayed on its outside. And it's just roaming around, either in our lymph, extracellular fluid, in our body, anywhere. It's just doing its thing. And it's the helper T cells that kind of sniff out those antigens and say, nah, you aren't supposed to be here. So, can't do anything about it except it taps the plasma B cells on the shoulder and says, hey, be on the lookout for antigens that look like this. So those B cells are on the lookout, hence the telescope, and when they find them, they mass produce these little proteins called antibodies. And those antibodies are going to play a critical role, which I want to zoom in on the next slide. But essentially what they do is they help to reel in and attract macrophages to those bad guys so they can be engulfed and destroyed. And in the meantime, the beauty of all this is that we have helper T cells that also tell memory B cells, hey, can you remember that antigen? So when we see that antibody, can you remember that antibody so that when we see that antigen again, we know exactly how to render it kind of harmless with those specific antibodies. And so that's why I drew little glasses on our memory B cell, as like they're the smart ones. They're the ones that really develop a little hard drive, a little archive of all the invading pathogens we've ever had. So this whole B cell response is called the humoral response, because the pathogen is free flowing. It has not invaded any cells. Now let's take a closer look at these antibodies. These antibodies are just little proteins that basically are custom built to match a specific antigen. And there's tons of different antibodies that your plasma B cells make. Just think about all the invading bad guys you've ever had. You have a library built up of these antibodies that are custom made for those antigens. And what's interesting is that antibodies don't kill bad guys. They just simply are handcuffs. Say, I'm not going to let you cause any more harm. I'm going to handcuff you. You're useless, but I'm not going to kill you. But that's pretty cool, because then what it does is it kind of clumps all those bad guys together. They can't do any harm. It agglutinates them, which is a fancy way of saying clumps them together. And what's cool is then these macrophages can come in and spot those clumped together pathogens, those antibodies, and come do their endocytosis and be done with it. So that's what's cool about those antibodies. And that is, like I said, the humoral response. We have our invading antigen, our foreign antigens, and basically they're detected by the helper T cell, and then they say, plasma B cell, you got to make a specific antibody. Which one is it going to be? And that takes a little bit of time to figure out which antibody will actually work for that antigen. Once they figure it out, those plasma B cells just go to town and replicate, making that custom antibody. And they release it. And basically they release all those handcuffs and agglutinate or clump the captured invaders together, and then those macrophages can come in and munch them up. That's the humoral response. But don't forget, the key of all this is our memory cells. So the next time you have that same invading antigen, those memory B cells know right away which antibody works. And you won't even know you're sick, because you can avoid the lag here to figure out which antibody is going to be the one. And so that's the beauty of humoral responses, is that once you've had that antigen, you immediately know how to fix it, how to get rid of it, so you don't even know you're sick. Now, if you've never had that particular antigen, it takes a while. It takes a while for your body to custom build the specific antibody for it. So you're sick for a little while until you figure it out. That's the humoral response. However, that invading bad guy sometimes actually infects our cells. And so now we need to rely on the killer T cells. So let's talk about their role. But let's back up. How do we even know if a cell is infected? Well, there's lots of different antigens on the surface of our cells. So there's an identifying antigen that we talked about, but there's also one called the MHC antigen. And its job is to display chunks of foreign antigens on the surface of our cells for the helper T cells to kind of get notified and alerted. So that infected cell displays fragments of the pathogen on the surface of its cells. Pretty cool. Let's look at it a little bit closer. But if you think about it, it's kind of like a wanted poster displayed on the outside of our cells. That wanted poster is a specific type of antigen called the major histocompatibility antigen. And like I said, it's like a wanted poster. It's a real-time snapshot of what's going on inside the cell that's constantly being updated. So if we have our invading pathogen here, little fragments are shown on the outside of the host cell. And that tips off the helper T cell. So let's start from the beginning again. Here's our bad guy with its foreign antigens. And it somehow gets inside of one of our cells, and those cells then display that particular antigen on the outside, the major histocompatibility antigen. That tells our helper T cells, here's what's going on. This cell is infected. You can see there's something inside there we got to take care of. So the helper T cell is going to notify a killer T cell to do its damage, to kill. It is a trained assassin. So it's going to look for those MHC antigens on other cells, and when it finds it, it's going to release a certain chemical that kills that cell. And just like in the B cell case, this is a case where there's also memory T cells. And this response is called the cell-mediated response. Let's take a full look at this. So we have our infected cell with the MHC antigen displayed. That tells helper T cells, hey, we got a problem here inside these cells. And that helper T cell is going to release a chemical called interleukin. Interleukin is going to tell those killer T cells, hey, you got to look for this MHC antigen. It's no good. And once it finds a cell with those MHC antigens, it's going to release a chemical called perforin that simply takes that infected cell and destroys it. Basically, it punches that chemical, kind of bores holes into that infected cell until it lyses, till it bursts open, killing it. Pretty cool. It perforates it. And then we have our memory killer T cells to remember that MHC antigen for future attacks. So then it can essentially just tell the killer T cells right away and then be off, be done. That's the cell-mediated response. So you can see we actually need two types of specific defenses depending on where the bad guy is. So if it's just roaming around free, we have to go through the humoral response with antibodies and kind of locking down that bad guy so macrophages can engulf it. But sometimes that bad guy invades cells, and so we need a different kind of response, a cell-mediated response with interleukin and perforin. But together, they make a pretty good pair for the third customized line of defense. And it all starts with these wonderful helper T cells, no matter if you're going the humoral route or the cell-mediated route. And that is the third line of defense. Thanks for listening.